Yeah, absolutely. Okay, hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Neil Austin. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate at the Omnicom Group, and I'm also the current chair of the New York chapter of Cornet. Thanks so much for registering today for this great panel discussion. The rise of suburbia. Is a hub and spoke model realistic? I'm sure you'll find this very interesting and topical. I certainly will be, and it's certainly a topic that I've been considering with my own company all around the world. As you're aware, this is another virtual event, which we've become very familiar with over the last year, but I can confirm as a chapter, we are definitely working on in-person events and meetups all the time. We've already had some meetups, and we do have the chapter awards and the golf days coming up very, very soon. So hopefully we'll be seeing you face-to-face and learning and networking together as soon as possible. I really hope you enjoy today's event. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Stephen, who will go through the housekeeping and introduce the great panel that we have today. Please enjoy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Neil, and welcome everyone to today's panel titled Rise of Suburbia, Is Hub and Spoke Model Realistic? A topic that has received increased attention over the last 15 months. I'm Stephen Coulthard, part of the Senior Management Group at Cumming Corporation and Chair of Cornet New York Chapter's Strategy and Portfolio Planning Committee, where we focus on issues real estate leaders need to know to talk to their businesses. Today, we have a very packed call, which we've divided into thirds. Our opening third, our panel will present data used to assess whether a hub and spoke model is appropriate for a business. In the middle third, we will break into a moderated panel discussion with our end users. And in the final third, our moderator will facilitate an open Q&A where he will invite members of the audience to turn on their cameras and ask the questions they raised in the chat. Usual rules apply. Given the Q&A, we don't have full control of your audio and video, so please keep them turned off unless invited to ask a question by the moderator. So back to today's topic. You can look forward to data and perspectives on whether a hub and spoke model is right for your business, about optimal locations to base employees and operational efficiencies of a dispersed portfolio, and how the pandemic has impacted the workforce and workspace supply. Our panelists today are James Rankin, who leads the Research and Insight Group at the Instant Group, who provides flexible workspace such as serviced co-working, and managed offices to clients in over 150 countries. Mark Hudson, Director of Transactions and Development at Verizon, overseeing 800 transactions annually, as well as the firm's ground-up real estate development and joint venture activity. Michael's team analyzes opportunities across Verizon's 100 million square feet real estate portfolio. John Saclarides, who goes by Sac, who is responsible for all of Wells Fargo's non-real estate transactions for Eastern US, Canada, Europe, Middle East, and South America. And finally, to our moderator today, David Hickey, who is Managing Director of Hickey Associates, a global leader in location strategy, labor analytics and economics incentives advisory. And with that, I will hand over to David. Thank you. Enjoy the panel.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Stephen. Excited to be here today and be with all of you on certainly quite a robust and at times even a controversial topic as we dig into. We certainly encourage everyone, as Stephen just worked through the some of that housekeeping there, is have an engaging conversation. And we want to start that off with a brief presentation, really reviewing what some of this data, some of these findings are, and those key insights from a recent report that did alongside our good friends at the Instant Group and James Rankin, Rise of Suburbia. Can a hub and spoke model really work? And really here we want to just spend a handful of minutes talking through what some of the data is, what some of those findings were, and why we actually even started this, and we did this study together. So I will turn it over before we get into the moderator panel. I'll turn it over to James, who will lead it, and we'll share this exciting data. Thank you.
David. So yeah, I mean, to kick things off, I mean, let's put some perspective on this. I think we started this over 6 months ago, kind of really in the heart of the pandemic, when everyone was still very much kind of working from home, and people were talking about disaggregated working models and hub and spoke models. And we wanted to really approach this and look at what the real life kind of case study would be for a business if they were to go down this approach. What does it mean for them, and what does it mean for their people? And ultimately, we expect change to take place, and we certainly sort of don't have all the answers. I think anyone that tells you they do is well, I won't say anything too impolite, but I think the thinking behind our research really lies in using a data-based approach to identify locations that are suitable for teams and individuals to kind of congregate on a more regular basis, while occasionally sort of traveling into a central headquarters location, and on occasion also working from home. The idea behind our thinking really was that many employees are going to be sort of less willing to travel back into a central office on a regular basis, given what they've gone through over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And some of those things we'll outline later on. But at the same time, companies and employers, really want to maintain a sense of community, company culture, and actually within their business sort of enable the collaboration element, which has been lacking. Sort of, I think most people have felt it's been lacking over the last, I'd say, 12 to 18 months. While sort of co-working locations exist in many sort of suburban locations, they tend to focus on sort of the freelancers and the entrepreneurs, and not really the corporate employee. And frankly, they can be just as noisy as, or more noisy and disturbing than working from home in most cases. So we wanted to sort of understand what these locations might be and what the real estate options are within them to kind of kick things off. So I think the rise of suburbia or disaggregated working models aren't new concepts. The sign that I'm showing here from the 1950s sort of indicates that, at least for a handful of decades, we've gradually seen this sort of expansion, certainly in a residential perspective outside of city centres. One area of commercial real estate that's sort of not really gone that way is the workspace or the office environment, which is traditionally been driven by large investments in city centre locations for a number of great reasons, particularly centralisation around travel hubs. But there's other sort of areas that maybe aren't as relevant today. One of those would be advertising or building your company from the top of a tall building, which in today's world of marketing, online marketing and digital presence is less valuable than maybe what it used to be sort of 50 years ago. Ultimately, the approach that we were kind of looking at was shifting the focus from place property to people. And the approach that we've taken in this sort of case study and this report firmly puts the people or the employees at the start of the journey. So very briefly, and I'll touch on this slightly later on, but why should we be considering maybe changing models, or why were people talking about it? I think ultimately it can be split into two different ways. On one side, you've got the individual. And again, we'll go into some detail about what the benefits are, but depending on where they're located, there's significant time saving likely to be achieved. There's significant cost saving. Increasingly, there's importance being put on sustainability and the cost to the environment for travel. Overall, it's an improved work-life balance and wellness. On the business side, I think there's some big things. Cost saving is certainly one of them, but shouldn't be looked at as the primary factor. There is definitely benefits to improved staff retention and attraction, which ultimately has costs assigned to it as well. But I think more importantly, it can allow companies to hold a more agile approach to their portfolio, allowing them to make change and react to changing market environments going forward. So those were the sort of the drivers that we were looking at when we sort of kicked off this report. So before I pass over to David, and I think we've got sort of a poll function within this topic today, but we wanted to get some feedback from all the people listening, and ultimately wake people up, I guess. Just ask what you feel will be sort of some of the bigger trends that we'll see in workplace strategy over the next 3 years, or in the next couple of years. We've kind of put a couple, I think 6 examples up here. We've got sort of an increase in home working, increased provision of closer to home working, negative impact on megacities, a change in workplace design, increased use of serviced or co-working spaces, and employee concentration risk assessments becoming more popular. So it'd be great if people can kind of just feed in their thoughts, and we can sort of look at those and touch on them maybe in the panel as we go through later on in the session. I think that should be shared. I can't see the results, so I'm hoping David can, and you can pick them up in the panel if so. If not, we'll share them with the audience. There we go. So I think the overriding factor there is the increase in home working, which we're all sort of, I think, starting to hear within our businesses. We've got a big kind of change or movement towards the change in workplace design, which again is something that we're here working with companies on their strategies, which is in terms of how do you maybe increase sort of certain behavioural presence or behaviours within your workplace, or how do you encourage certain activities. Interestingly, here we've got the increased in provision of close to home working, which is really sort of what the report was going on, is relatively low, just 5%. That's changed, I think, over the last, as I say, 6 to 8 months. We've done this report. We launched this both in the UK and in Singapore a number of months ago, and there was more support for that. I think as we're sort of starting to get people back into the offices, that mindset is starting to change, and the focus is very much of how do we get people back in, and then we can take a breath and figure out what we're going to do next. So David, just passing over to you, and if you're happy to sort of take through some of the attributes that we sort of looked at in terms of how do we decide on where different locations might be suitable.
Yeah, thank you, James. And really what we've done in discussing and taking on the study in the first place was really to drive the process, the understanding from an empirical approach, and to really look at the different data sets and drill in through the analytics to understand what is that value in doing a hub and spoke? What is that value in even evaluating this model as part of the business, and in doing it, whether we're in a pandemic, we're not in a pandemic, we're status quo, whatever that might be, what are those main drivers? And so every time we build one of these models and we look at and doing these different analyses, different ways that it's shaped and the different attributes that it'll play and what those weighting that criteria is. For this particular study, what we did together was we focused on 20 represented global markets, of course, New York City being one of those, and really looked at those that were established innovation hubs, high growth markets for the future. And many of those markets that we would benchmark, not that anyone can benchmark New York City, but we certainly would as from a global perspective. And we're looking at the different roles and different people, different individuals that you're looking for into the future. And then drill down from there. So within the market itself, so through greater New York City area, where would be some of those sub-markets, those core areas that would be most advantageous perhaps for a hub and spoke type of approach. So we looked at it from a commute time element, of course, and relatively heavy. And as we talk about some propensity, and we'll talk as we go forward, what is the share of population? For this particular study, many we're doing today, we had a conversation yesterday more on the Gen Z, the millennials. For this particular report on some of the younger millennials and out from there. Some of that more management to executive level talent is what that basis for that 35%. Also looking at income, what is some of that medium household income and quality of life and cost of living, and then focusing on some of those skills itself. So what are the types of roles? What are those types of, not the industry, but the actual skills and skill sets that are in place, and where do they reside? Where are those on an individual basis? Driving someone on where the business is, but really what is that focus on where the talent actually lives? And that's both on an occupation base and then as well as the concentration. So how dense are those roles in those particular locations, among a number of others, walk, bike, mode shares, some of the urban rail crowding, maybe not as much of a challenge as it was 2 years ago, but certainly an element, growth rates, and others based on the cohort here.
So before we sort of dive into the outcomes and the findings, and maybe through some of the location analysis, I just wanted to sort of touch on what we're seeing kind of now and what we have been seeing and why this was sort of relevant. Ultimately, it was because we were seeing quite a strong rise in sort of secondary markets and suburban markets over the last 12 months from a demand perspective. So the suburban locations around New York, within sort of an hour and a half radius, we're seeing a dramatic increase in the demand for flexible working coming through our business. That was the same across Europe, across other US cities, and also many major APAC markets. In the US specifically, that sort of trend was taken one step further, where we were seeing far larger demand growth in markets such as Denver and Austin, sort of lifestyle cities, than we were seeing in markets such as San Francisco and New York, which were traditional sort of big corporate hubs. And when we started to sort of dig into that in more detail, not only were we seeing demand sort of rising in those markets, but we're also seeing rates stay relatively stable or increase. Whereas in somewhere like San Francisco or New York, the rates were taking a dramatic decline as the demand dropped off in the wake of the pandemic. Now, some of those trends are starting to change in New York. I'm glad to see we're starting to see some of that come back. But in other markets such as San Francisco, it looks to be a long time before we start to see stabilization and certainly growth coming back into the market. So that was sort of what led us down this approach, was this really kind of drive from a flexible market perspective on where people were looking for space. So David, just passing back over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Just as an item of quick housekeeping, please utilize the chat function to all the attendees to ask questions, and we'll engage and make this a very interactive session here in just a little bit. So please, as we go along, you can post those questions in the chat feature, which you should all find in the bottom center of your screen in the Zoom platform here. So what we're looking at right now is a mobility report. And for those within the New York City area, and really anywhere over the past year and a half, much of this shouldn't be a great surprise. But you can start to see over time how much that shift and where individuals in New York City, greater metro area, have been spending their time, and where they have been spending their time, and also how they've been mobile. How have they moved, or have they not? And you can see that it is pretty clear, when the first on-rise of the pandemic, they're in mid-March, patient zero, and as we move forward, you can see that sharp drop off. When that attendance rate dropped off significantly, workplace down more than 70%. This is overall mobility, so most of that workforce that we work with on a daily basis, while significantly more on that replacement of at home and being at the residence. And you can see that now over time that has leveled off. You can see historically as well where some of those dips are, where we have holidays, where we have other days, where that mobility and where that drop off occurs. And you can see how that has continued, and still today, many would debate this, but we're still 30% below usage, probably much higher than that, depending on the role, depending on the occupation in the industry sector that you're in. But these are certainly, as we looked at this and built this out over historical time, and this is looking at March to basically just up to the July 4th holiday, where that is in those trend lines. And while the trend lines have started to return, it is still far off from anything normal. The crystal ball, and I'm sure as the questions will be now going forward, is where does this now go from here, and how quickly does that return? So when we start looking at this idea of the hub and spoke, and looking at where are these opportunities from, especially focus on a talent basis to be able to capture these employees, and it's really a combination of where the density of that talent, what is the commute times, those commute time challenges when it looks at coming into traditional midtown, downtown, coming into a Grand Station, Grand Central, a Penn Station, and the like, versus if they didn't have to, or from short term, or one of these hybrid approaches that we hear about every day, and some of that closer to work, closer to home, and where could these best opportunities be into the near future? Now, again, the hub and spoke model is not a new concept to New Yorkers, as the approach, and as we do have suburban campuses all throughout, depending on whichever direction you go in out of the city. But now looking at it again, and perhaps in a different approach, and what James is speaking to, and perhaps on a service office or my temporary or workspaces and the like. So when we start looking at that and start looking at some of the data and building in, so here on an age cohort perspective, so we look at that millennial base and really the younger side of that millennial base, you can see a lot of that concentration, particularly in the workforce, is pretty close and well within the city, not as much as we go further out. And a lot of this workforce we look at today is very finance-based as well, just as we wanted to identify and drill into an occupation and sector set as we discussed earlier. So you can start to see where that is. Now, if you go to the next slide, you can then start to see the flip. And as the age cohort begins to continue to get older, and that finance workforce certainly starts expanding out. And so being as focused and core to the center, but going out to the suburbs more into that realm and into that natural. Now we saw in these past 18 months, perhaps a speed up of some of that, also expeditious on some of the younger side, and that data is still being ironed out and being released, but pretty fascinating. And then as we go forward, and we start seeing, okay, well, where is that, sorry, one slide back. So where are those actual finance occupations? Where are those heavy densities and concentration of where these individuals live? And now you can start to see that. Now there are a lot that still live in the city and work within the sector, but you can start to see those concentrations as you go further out. So when we dug in, we looked at all the different models and the perspective we looked at before. What are some of those sub-markets which would be most keen and most set for some of these opportunities to be in a hub and spoke set? That combination of a longer commute time into the CBDs, the traditional markets of Manhattan, versus the better, more optimal location for that hub and spoke. You can see we looked at it from a car perspective, from a public transport, and then as well as some of these other cohorts, looked at the median household income and blended this into the model. And what are three of those? Not to say that the top three necessarily, but where they came out here, one to the east and looking at Huntington. And out from that perspective and that time to come into the city, and those that did that on a daily basis know it very well. Of course, a shift to more of a hybrid, whether that's a 2-day, a 4-day, however that might be, but having that spoke. Looking even down towards Trenton and into that direction. And in that sense, also expanding some of that labor pool and that opportunity. We don't talk that much about it in this report, but when we start looking at and in today, and then a lot of our clients are starting to realize, is as we can expand and look at some of this hub and spoke, is even further on some wage savings as well, and some of those cost of living challenges. And in the other direction, looking up north, towards a Nyack, and where some of that opportunity could be. Now, many of you on this call today within your portfolio may very well have office locations in these different markets and know it well, and know some of those great opportunities as well as some of the challenges that can be presented. But part of this and part of this exercise as well was to look at, what about in the new world, in this new environment, and perhaps as a service office solution that could work in some of these markets that aren't as busy, that aren't as attractive today. And certainly happy to dig in more of this certainly in the report as well. I'll turn it back over to James.
So just conscious of time and getting onto the panel, so I'm just going to very quickly touch on the last two slides, which is sort of what the benefits from the company and the employee, I should say, are. We're sort of looking at this approach. In the case study, in this particular one, we looked at the financial sector using kind of a company of around 600 employees, an office space of 600 employees in the financial districts of Manhattan. And was breaking down against those sort of locations, those 4 locations that David mentioned came out highest in the report. And the top line, stats are there are cost savings as you'd expect by moving outside of New York, but they're actually quite significant, particularly if you then start adopting sort of flexible and agile workspace models where you don't have to invest in higher headcount to run those spaces. You're saving on your CapEx. And you don't have, you've got kind of standardized or fixed costs throughout the lifetime of that tenancy. So what we were seeing in a top line sort of view is about an 18% saving for an employer by putting 50% of their workforce into these sort of 4 spoke locations that we'd identified rather than the financial district of Manhattan. On top of that, you've got sort of the harder to quantify benefits, such as the increased sort of staffing retention. You've expected to have higher productivity given the research that we've seen, which indicates that those people that are saving an hour to 2 hours on a commute are spending maybe 40% of that working, rather than just sort of using it as leisure time. But on top of that, you've also got your agile element, which should theoretically deliver savings going forward. From a personal perspective, and I think this is almost more important, certainly with CEO surveys sort of now suggesting that people are the number one concern, and I think the spotlight's now never been brighter on the employee productivity and employee wellness. We wanted to understand what the savings were from the employee's perspective. The top line, 3 elements that I mentioned before, well, across those 4 locations, you're looking at over an hour and a half commute a day, so, which is quite significant when you think about that over a year. I think it's roughly about 35 working days that you're asking an individual to give to their company in commute time. Savings wise, maybe it's less important, but it's still a factor, I think, which is nearly $4,500 that individuals would save. That's by commuting by public transport. And if you were looking to do that in your car, you're probably looking on average around 12,000 miles if you're doing that every single day, which again, from an environmental factor, is something companies again are starting to pay more attention to. So ultimately, that all feeds into hopefully a more happy, more engaged workforce with a better sort of overall wellness factor, which should pay out from a company perspective. So the thing that we haven't touched on, but we cover off in the report, I want to get over to the panel, is sort of the real estate sector ready for such a move? The short answer in every market we looked at is no. There are small co-working spaces, but the quality of corporate-friendly, shall we say, agile space or corporate-ready traditional space is very, very limited. In Manhattan, we looked at if just 3% of, which is still a large number, but 3% of the current office workforce in Manhattan looked to move to suburban markets, the suburban real estate market would be completely overwhelmed and wouldn't be able to cope. So it's a shift, but that's not a huge shift if you think about percentage-wise. And that was sort of mirrored at a global level across all the markets we looked at, which is any more than sort of 5% swing, these suburban markets just wouldn't be able to cope, given the lack of investment that's been sort of seen over the last couple of decades. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to the panel and back to David. If anyone wants sort of more information, I'll post a link to the full report that we downloaded in the chat. David, over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, James. And just to a couple quick questions that did come from in the audience regarding the report. I think one regarding one of the numbers on the headers, I think we may have transposed, but it's related to the finance occupations that are listed there. And then a great question on traffic rates and looking at public transport. It also looks at traffic and whether or not some of that has returned. And any one of us that have driven into the city lately and has tried to cross points like the Williamsburg Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge certainly sees that a lot of that traffic is back. And in fact, in some of the corridors is higher than some of the pre-pandemic levels. And I saw a data point the other day that several months ago, it took buses were moving within the city at 9.5 to 10 miles an hour on average, and now we're back and in some places lower than it was during the pandemic at just over 8 miles an hour. So as that shows, and as it shows some of the commute trends, it's pretty fascinating to say the least. So please do ask more questions through the chat function and we'll engage that. But let's hop into the panel. So I'm excited, Mike, Sac, and James here and getting in. And one of the questions, just to jump right into it, we'll start with you, Mike. Yeah, so if you tell us, and for those that have the opportunity to work with you before, what is your role at Verizon, and during COVID, how has some of that changed and the approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for having me. Certainly a topic that we've been following very diligently for the last 24 months even. And I oversee Michael Hudson, Director of Real Estate Transactions and Joint Ventures for Verizon. So I oversee the asset management of our 100 million square foot portfolio and about 801,000 transactions per year. So we're busy. How has that role changed during COVID? It hasn't. Very, very simply, we have been working on a hypothesis for a number of years that, to make the workplace purposeful, you have to make the workplace the destination. You have to entice employees to want to come to the office. Technology has been enabling us for years to work, remotely, to work in a variety of different ways. And we've really leaned into the hub and spoke topic that we're speaking to today, in the sense of create a workplace where people want to come, and you will drive high attendance and you will drive the high collaboration that leads to the business outputs you're looking for. So if anything, it's been an accelerant of our strategy. We really haven't shifted in the way of how we think through either the hub or the spoke markets.
Very good. Thank you. Zach.
Hey, good to be here with all of you. Boy, look forward to seeing all of you in person. Glad to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. But hopefully this is the last virtual event we get involved in. But I'm John Saclarides. I go by Sac. I'm with Wells Fargo, and I'm responsible for our non-retail transactions in the eastern half of the United States, as well as Europe, Canada, and South America. It's about a 45 million square foot or so portfolio. But in any case, from our standpoint, we haven't, the biggest change that I see that during this pandemic was that we opted not to renew. When some leases came up, our leadership just was unclear of how long this would last and what the future held. So we opted just not to renew several leases. The thinking was that that space will likely still be there in the not too distant future should we want to come back. And in fact, that's what's taken place. So we opted out of renewing many locations. Everybody continued to work from home. We came back and we're now in the process of renewing some of these leases, albeit at a shorter term than we would have otherwise done. Still a little unsure of what the return to office is going to hold. We're digging in big time at how to orchestrate that return to office and what requirements, if any, we're going to place on folks on the amount of flexibility that our leadership will allow. And I've already seen our leadership, and God bless them. I mean, they're trying to manage 220,000 people and doing all sorts of jobs, job functions, and how they're gonna approach this. So it's been vacillating sort of back and forth, want to be office centric, then want to peel back on that just a touch to allow a little more flexibility. Personally, I think that it's going to be a flexible model. I like Mike's term that he referred to earlier, an accelerant. The pandemic, we view this, and where I've seen it as an accelerant to an approach that we were already undertaking in our layouts and how we approach the hybrid work. Now everybody has learned how to do it, so it's much easier and it's much faster to get there.
Okay, very good, thank you. So I, as I sit here today, I'm in North Williamsburg, working from here. Mike, I believe you're in Brooklyn as well. We hear a lot of talk, it's a lot out there of a return to Manhattan. Some of these conversations about a midtown, downtown, Hudson Yards, and some of the other traditional markets. Do you see your organization making any kind of additional shift or strategy outside of those traditional markets? And besides your organization, otherwise, do you see COVID driving some of that as well to a Long Island City? I see a Williamsburg, a Dumbo, Jersey City, and others driven through and due to the pandemic as well.
Not particularly. When we think about the hub nature of that portion of our portfolio, we're trying to accommodate a multi-generational workforce. So I think the slides you guys showed in the report were very demonstrative of exactly that you have millennials that are more city-centric and the older generations that are maybe have moved out to the suburbs. And you need to counter to everybody. Where I think that has shifted is you have new centers of gravity. You're no longer focused on Midtown Manhattan or Wall Street. You have the advent of Hudson Yards. You do have different pockets of Manhattan that are expanding, that are changing, that are transforming, that really build in and lean towards, for us as a TAMI tenant, that experiential multi-use functionality with a ton of amenities that cater to that wide. We're not looking for just the 22-year-old engineers and the 50+ CEOs. It's how do you attract and retain that top talent, and it's bringing a little bit of everything for everyone and finding that mixture. We don't want to isolate the suburban habitants by going to a Dumbo, as much as I love it, a little hard to get to from a central New Jersey or Connecticut. So when we think about the hub piece of that strategy, it's really on how do you accommodate the largest breadth of employee base and providing that employee base, creating and curating an ecosystem around an opt-in mentality where you can do everything you want to do. You mentioned before, being able to work out, being able to have that downtime, eating healthy, that maybe we weren't doing as much when we were going from train to plane to the office space, from meeting to meeting to meeting, you're grabbing something on the go. But how do you find the space and partner with the landlords that are developing and rethinking and reimagining their urban campuses or into some semi-urban areas that have a little bit more space, like a Chicago or a Dallas? How are you thinking through that mixed use nature? So when we think about Manhattan, to circle back to the question, it's really focused on being within the island of Manhattan. But where we're thinking about those locations aren't necessarily in the maybe antiquated traditional sub-markets within the island.
Yeah, from our standpoint, Wells Fargo, where we've got 80 some odd million feet globally, it's we kind of scratch our head and say, well, what is a hub and spoke when we've got millions of feet in the Philippines and millions of feet in India? Traditionally, not traditionally, but factually, we're not born and raised in New York City, although we have a major presence there. We're just a small percentage compared to our peers like Citi and JP Morgan and B of A, all of whom were born and raised in Manhattan. Well, B of A may not have been born and raised, but they did pick up Merrill Lynch, which was a major presence that they had in New York. So we have grown organically on a front office basis in Manhattan, such that we have 1 million square feet in Manhattan and two primary hubs, one at Hudson Yards and one at Grand Central, each of about 500,000 feet or so. And those are front office operations and some of the support functions that they need to have close by: technology, legal, risk, whatever it is, real estate. So they're relatively close by. But our biggest hubs are going to be in places like Phoenix, Minneapolis, Des Moines, Charlotte. And that's where we've grown. I sit here in Charlotte, where we've got 27,000 employees here. So in a market as small as Charlotte, we employ, I would call it a sub hub and spoke strategy, where we've got couple 3-4 million feet in the center city of Charlotte, and then we've got 3 or 4 million feet in suburbia, based in 2 or 3 sort of campus-like settings. So that affords, I know it sounds funny for the New Yorkers because the commutes here aren't even close to what you guys experience, but it provides a nice little plume of recruiting areas where we can bring folks into the office. So all of that is maintained, and we don't see, I don't see, some of the stuff is just me talking. I know it'll shock you to know that our leadership doesn't allow me into the room when they're making these decisions, but I don't see us peeling back on New York one bit. If anything, it'll go the other way. Maybe you have heard that, and I don't know what constitutes a headquarters. Certainly some of it is legal in nature and some of it is practical in nature. Well, legally our headquarters is in San Francisco. Practically our entire C-suite sits at Hudson Yards. So you tell me where our headquarters is, but that has taken place over the course of the last 18 months or so. And as you probably know, that has a certain gravitational pull to it. And we will likely experience some of that. And depending on how we utilize our space in the future, I don't see any change in our, if anything, it's going to be an increased presence in Manhattan. We do own a building, 150,000 foot building over in Summit, New Jersey. We do lease 100,000 feet or so out on Long Island. We've got a smattering of smaller loan offices in the suburbs, but nothing of huge proportion.
It's fascinating. Thank you. And it's so to hear from a New York's perspective. Let me again remind everyone to, if questions, please use the chat function. We'll open up through there and open it up in just a moment. But I also wanted to pose this question to James, and from your perspective and what your clients directly are asking and looking for, and and from an enterprise level, as well as some of those bespoke options also.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, we spent the last 18 to 12 months doing nothing but really trying to talk to heads of CRE and senior leadership across our clients to understand what their thinking is and what direction they're going in, so we can try and support that. I mean, the overriding statement is very few people have a firm direction on where their future is going to be. I mean, we did a load of interviews throughout the pandemic, and I think that the figure that we came out with basically just 7% of the businesses had a firm sort of return to work plan or future workplace strategy plan. Most of them had some short-term ideas of what they were going to do to Mike's point, encourage the employees back into the workplaces they've got. And then over the coming sort of number of years, as lease events appear, work through what their strategy is going to be, in terms of, do they keep those spaces? Do they look to bring in more agility through different options, which was a big factor. I think the thing that is overriding is the need to be able to measure outcomes or outputs from those locations that they have already or they're moving into. Being able to measure them, to learn from them, and then kind of make changes. And traditionally, I think we're hearing the challenge has been that you take something on for 10, 15 years and you're limited to what you can do within that space, particularly if you've made the large investment of fitting it out to your relatively high, normally corporate standard. So what people are looking for now, and what our clients are looking for, is space that allows them to either move in or out, downsize, upsize, but also within the space, make changes on kind of a fairly regular basis and not have to do that at great expense. So that seems to be the big thing, sort of the test, learn, to sort of test, measure, learn, and react sort of cycle, which what we're hearing isn't going to be a short-term thing. It's going to be kind of the state of real estate going forward, which I think is probably something relatively new, considering the fairly established industry that we're in.
Good, thank you. So we, some within the industry, and depending on who you talk to and where you are and geography and the sectors, there's a concern that continuing or a hub and spoke model, but then also continuing in where we are today, may disrupt corporate identities. It could break up company culture. Really sitting in decentralized locations, creating some of those challenges, and some of those, we've even talked briefly today. I am going to, let me open it up. So please share your camera and, looks like he can't go on camera, but in audio, Richard from Lance Capital has a question for the panelists. Looks like if Richard's on mute, Richard's question to the group was whether or not, how do you avoid spoke employees becoming second-class citizens, or diluting and falling off over time in a hub and spoke model? And Zach, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's one of the pieces of collateral damage I think that can come from this. And I'll go back to what Mike was referring to earlier. Is you create a space that where people want to come in to the office, and I think the issue there is that the spoke isn't just a two-person office. I mean, if the spoke needs to have a certain amount of critical mass in there, whereby the corporate culture kind of comes through, and you do have the camaraderie and the just the connections that aren't necessarily directly into the hub, but you've got a critical mass that's more than just a few people. That's also obviously the danger from allowing a lot of work from home proposition, which is the ultimate spoke, right? I mean, you're just out there on an island on your own. And so you just have to be careful. Again, this is me talking. This is one of those things where it's going to take a long time for the results to come in and sink in as to how much deterioration of corporate culture and growth of individuals, particularly the young folks, how much line do you want these folks to have with the ability to work from home without getting all of that from into the office? And time will tell, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of adjustments between now and then.
I echo that point. I mean, I think it's a big challenge, and I think it's a great question. The point that you made there is that there needs to be critical mass, but I think more than that, there also needs to be leadership and relatively senior leadership, at least at parts of that working week. I mean, what we've seen in the past with hub and spoke models is, one, they've primarily been based around cost reduction, cost efficiencies. So they've been put in fairly low cost locations, which tends to mean people don't necessarily want to go there because they also haven't been invested into the same level. But equally, the senior leadership really haven't spent much time in those locations. And I think with whatever business you're in, people want exposure to leadership for a number of different reasons. So if it's if it's a route you're going down, you're looking at, then it has to also involve sort of a HR element of making sure that senior leadership are present in such locations, at least on an occasional basis, and therefore people feel like they're part of the wider business, not just a subculture.
I think that's a great point on the the spoke in the past had been driven by cost, and for us it's more purposeful, as to, you're not keeping the 20-person office in Des Moines because you had a 20-person office in Des Moines, but if there's a critical mass of accounting talent and we think that could be a hub and there's a purpose to it, that's how your spoke nature of your portfolio evolves, whether it's in and around the primary, secondary, or tertiary cities. And I think every organization is having that conversation now as it pertains to leadership and how you mitigate that divide between the hubs, the HQs, and those spoke locations. And the fact that we're having that, that narrative is present in leadership conversations today. It's going to be an iterative process, and the panel has said it a number of times. We're figuring this out on the fly, and I think being conscious of that divide is the first step in addressing it.
Great thing. So good question just came in, and I'll turn it over. Connie Studio, if you could come on video and audio to ask your question, please.
Sure. So as we, people are moving to different models, my question is really, what are you changing within organizations to actually measure? So I've worked on a lot of workplace strategy, and you can do a great build out. You can have all the right locations. You can still have managers that aren't well skilled at this, particularly in a hybrid type of mode or hub and spoke, where so my question is, what are organizations doing to train those managers, or to get the feedback loop in terms of this, so that at the end of the day, it's a good experience that really works for the people occupying those spaces, and for the overall organization, that it's being used well, and that it's a consistent experience.
I can jump in really quickly on that one. Connie, it's a great question. Going back to the strategy accelerant piece, we've built out a workplace experience team over the last number of years that is highly focused on the change management that comes with the shift in work styles, beyond just, hey, you're moving from building 1 to building 2 and there's a change in where you're physically located. I can speak for us personally. We have a multimodal, multi-month communication plan that is built into every phase of this return to work. We're starting with our early waves now over the summer when there's we're essentially in beta. We're learning, we're iterating as we go as to what's working from a technology, from experience, where the touch points are and are not happening. And we have proactively planned for the number of months as to how we're going to continue checking in and following. We're fortunate to be a technology company. It's all we have QR codes and Monte Carlo simulations that enable us to both capture and analyze that data in real time to understand where those touch points really are and how we can continue to shift our strategy to accommodate people's actual habits. So, to summarize that, it's not one set of training. It's not one set of here's 4 hours on a Friday and learn the new tools you have available, but it's that continual touch point, at least for the next 6 months. And we are highly conscious that it's going to continue well into 2022 as this, whatever this is our new normal, that hybrid type workplace.
Yeah, we've got the same setup. We've got a whole group historically. Actually, that group was set up prior to what Mike had said earlier. This is an accelerant. So we had a big change management organization in place and still do. Their focus is all on return to office these days. And so there's a lot of communication around that. What I don't know about is how we're going to monitor. We'll monitor its utilization and their patterns and all of that. But productivity and I'm not quite sure how that's going to be determined. I know we will go out with some surveys as to their connection and how they're feeling at the office and how this is working for them, and do those kinds of follow-ups. But I hate to say I'm not quite sure what we're going to do on the productivity front to find out how the future of all this compares to what it was like, 5 days a week in the office type thing.
The one thing that we're seeing is that, sort of from a data standpoint, companies tend to have a good handle on the occupancy, the day-to-day occupancy. But to Zach, you mentioned utilization there, which for us is actually understanding how people are using that space in that building in terms of not necessarily at an individual level, but where a cluster is forming and where is work being done, and what types of space are being used or not used. And I think that is something that most companies, broadly speaking, don't have a great handle on at the moment, and will be working towards trying to gain some visibility on, because if you can kind of get that, then that's the next step. And then I think after that, then the holy grail is productivity and elements like that, which very few companies, really only those in sort of consultancy or that are able to bill by the hour can actually really manage from a revenue perspective at the moment. But I think we'll see further development probably from the tech side on how that sort of element can be measured.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword in that the employees would like to have the flexibility. And some of them may want to be more flexible and work a little bit more from home. Well, and so this is the employee retention thing, right? So the companies are having to decide how much space or how much leeway do we allow for that to retain the employee. Then on the other side of the coin there, the more the employee are away in a distant spoke, not necessarily one with critical mass, but maybe working from home a little more frequently, they may start to feel a little bit more disconnected or maybe a little less loyal to that company, whereby they're more willing to entertain offers to take their employment elsewhere and move. So I suspect we're going to be looking at our turnover rates going forward with all this as well.
Just to, I guess, counter that slightly. we're seeing, and I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in the UK certainly, the new generation coming into the workforce, there was 35% in the recent UK government survey that showed that they all had second jobs anyway. 35% of them had second jobs anyway. So, I mean, I guess where I may be being slightly controversial is how loyal are they right now? Because I think we're going to see an increasing rise of these sort of side hustle, side gig, whatever you want to call it, and from your traditional corporate employees that wouldn't have had that sort of activity in the past. And I know there's legal and HR ways around that, but it seems to be moving in one direction in the UK. I don't know about the US.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. It's on the attrition rates, and thank you for bringing up retention. It's as location driving more and more from this of not only recruitment of talent and that talent of today and well into the future, but it's also that retention side and how location drives it. And as we continue to learn more, and as we come out of this learning more and more, and on that attrition side, so that 35% number is not that surprising. And we saw some shifts, and especially here in the New York metro area, where those gig workers also were able to qualify for unemployment, and just how some of that and some of the additional safety nets that didn't exist before the pandemic. Now, we see the unemployment and some of the challenges and what's coming from that, but we still have one of the, we have the highest quit rate in the history of this country right now, at least since tracking. And while a lot of that is focused in leisure and hospitality and other sectors, overall across the board, even in manufacturing, we are at the highest point ever and well above normal averages, and seeing that. And so more and more how location is going to drive into it, as well as the rest of the engagement. Before we close out, and Stephen Mike, any closing thoughts on retention and location and how that drives talent?
I was just going to build that's where that decision on where, and it's not just physically where you're located, but all the amenities and being able to cater that multi-generational talent to not only attract but retain. I think that's where having a workplace that is experiential, that is special, that does drive people into the office, it enables you to really leverage that as a focus area of collaboration. And we can all think back to the early parts of our career when you got pulled in an office and you sat on a phone call on mute just to listen and absorb. And that's where that leadership piece comes in. And one, as real estate executives, we need to make sure that we're helping have that dialogue and that conversation, understanding what the business needs, so we can address that with our real estate, strategies and plans. But it's equal parts ensuring that that is not just a crutch of, well, the real estate isn't getting it done. So I think it's that mixture of challenging the business as well as being a great partner too, and finding that happy medium that creates a workplace that's purposeful, that drives attraction because of how you've built it out and how you've designed it. And people are going to want to come, and as they come on their own without mandates, they're going to feel that attraction to the company, and it will increase loyalty to a degree. You're never going to solve for attrition 100%, but the more you can curate that environment, the more success you'll have long term with your top talent.
Great, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to I see Stephen on here, and as we come up to the top. So thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you, James, for the presentation earlier, and major thanks to Mike and Sac for volunteering and participating on the panel. It was a great, robust discussion. Really excited, very much was looking forward to it. And thank you all, and of course, thank you to the chapter and to all of our sponsors. And I will turn it over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, David.
Stephen, I think you're muted. Yep.
And this is why we need offices, guys. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.